All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for your patience. End of the school year doesn't always mean it's not busy. So it is my pleasure to welcome today Dr. Courtney Cogburn. And she has a pretty cool bio, so I would love to read the whole thing into the record. Dr. Courtney Cogburn is a tenured associate professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work. She is a faculty member of the Columbia Population Research Center. She is a leading scholar in racial equity research, and she employs a transdisciplinary approach to deepen our understanding of racism as a structural force shaping health and social outcomes. Her work is dedicated to advancing how racism is measured and conceptualized. She's also a pioneer in leveraging media and technology as tools for social change. She is the lead creator of 1000 Cut Journey, which is a groundbreaking, immersive virtual reality experience that allows participants to step into the life of a Black male experiencing racism at different life stages. This premiered at the 2018 Tribeca Film Festival, and it was instrumental in reshaping conversations around racial injustice by fostering awareness and engagement with systemic social and racial inequities in society. And her research further explores the psychological and social effects of immersive media and examines how such experiences can shift attitudes and beliefs about racism. She's currently also working on a book project exploring the health benefits of imagination. Here at LEAP, she is the Director of Knowledge Transfer, and she serves as our Chief Broadening Participation Officer. She holds a BA in psychology from UVA, an MSW from the University of Michigan, a PhD in education and psychology from the University of Michigan, and she did her postdoctoral training at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan. While I go take a breath, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Courtney Cogburn.
Hi. Thanks, everyone. I love our summer activities here at LEAP. It's such a great opportunity to connect and get to know each other. I hope you've been having a great summer so far. So just a couple of notes. So one, I know that we often are trying to multitask and do multiple things. I don't know if you've ever had to present in front of a room, but it's not fun if it feels like people are coding or doing something else instead of listening. I get it, but if you need to do that, I would just ask that maybe you exit the room and handle what you need to handle and then come back and be present in the space. Otherwise, I appreciate your presence and engagement with me. Thank you, Catherine, for the warm introduction. It's always uncomfortable watching someone talk about you while you're standing there. But I do want to give some context for why I think all of that matters and why I'm here at LEAP. So I consider myself a transdisciplinary social scientist. One of my favorite quotes, it's not mine, it was said to me, but I can't remember who said it to me, is there are people who solve the problems of their disciplines, and there are people who solve the problems of the world. I consider myself in that second bucket. The ways that I engage with research, my reasons for engaging with research are ultimately about making the world a better place. And I'm very clear that I can't do that on my own. I can't do that from psychology. I can't do that from social work. I can't do that from data science. I have to engage multiple disciplinary perspectives, multiple types of knowledge and expertise that go well beyond my own. And so I often work in collaboration with others. And it's why I find myself in places like a social worker, psychologist, and a climate modeling center. How does that happen, right? I'm working with people who want to change the world. I'm trying to figure out how we maximize the impact that LEAP has on the world, which I have to say is challenge. It's very, very difficult given the nature of our science and research. It's so far upstream in most cases. It can be difficult to see, how do I go from ice particle formation to social impact, or trying to help the mayor's office make better decisions about how to respond to the climate crisis. But that is part of what we are charged with doing as a science and technology center. So I want to start there. So as a science and technology center, part of what we have to I'll go back. Part of what we have to, part of our mandate is to think about how to translate our work for social impact. And that can be very different than, say, your typical research lab. So it's part of orienting people to working in this space is to consider their relationship to issues like climate justice, the climate crisis, resilience practices, et cetera. Even if your work feels very far removed from it, we want you to start engaging in that process with us and thinking about where you can contribute. And that's really the focus of what we're doing today, is to give you an opportunity to sort of reflect on your own and then reflect in small groups to try and identify small and maybe bigger ways that you're able to make contributions in these spaces. Okay. So what we'll do first, we'll think about who we are and who's in the room. And then I have questions about who we think is responsible for doing something about climate injustice and what you even think that means. And then spending some time thinking about our spheres of influence and where we're locating ourselves in relation to the problem of climate justice. Um, Again, emphasizing that broadening participation and which is what we call it now, and things like knowledge transfer aren't add-ons to what we do here at LEAP. It's central to our mandate and what we're being asked to accomplish. Sometimes scientists can think of themselves as, I do the science, someone else figures out how to have impact in the world. That's not my job. That's partly true, right? You are here with a focus, a scientific focus, and what you're trying to learn and what you're being trained to do. But as a member of this community, we are asking that you engage us with these questions, that you help us find opportunities for impact as it relates to your work. And so our time together today is to try and help you find where that might be. It may be very different than a social worker psychologist who studies racism. My impact and how I might translate into the world may be much more obvious than it may be for you. But we do want you to think about how your professional life and your personal life intersects with the questions of the climate crisis more broadly in terms of how it impacts social and human spaces. So that's part of what we'll do. The other piece of what's central to how we approach this at LEAP is bidirectional knowledge transfer. This is from the National Science Foundation, this is called knowledge transfer. We call it bidirectional knowledge transfer. And the reason we say that is we're not just producing science and then handing it off and hoping someone might find it useful. We consider it bidirectional knowledge transfer because at some level we're acknowledging that we only understand part of the problem. And if we want to have a greater understanding, a broader scope of that problem, we have to engage people who work in other spaces. So we spend a lot of time thinking about engaging, speaking with stakeholders throughout the sort of ecosystem of people addressing and thinking about the climate crisis. People who are thinking about transportation issues, people who are thinking about insurance, people who are thinking about housing, right? And so we're trying to get a sense of what questions are you asking? What data do you need? What do you understand about the problem that may or may not have direct implications for what we're doing here at LEAP? But what the argument is, we certainly won't find the potential for those connections if we don't at least have the conversation. If we just assume, oh, my work is not translatable, then it won't be. Right. So we're trying to create opportunities for all of us to think about and find those connections wherever they may be. And there's various ways to think about real world reach. It may not be directly through your research. You may not be handing a data set to the mayor's office to use in their decision making. But again, there's a range, there's a spectrum of ways that we might think about that we can have a positive impact. So who's in the room shapes what we can know. So it affects what questions get asked, what data we trust, and who the science serves. So we spend a lot of time thinking even about the diversity of people in this room, diversity on a number of metrics, where you're from, your disciplinary backgrounds, what you've done in your lives before getting here that might contribute and help us think about these questions in rich and interesting ways. Homogeneity doesn't really serve us well when we're trying to deal with complex social issues. Um, we also want to think about where harm lands, who is being most gravely impacted by the things that we're studying. So even if your research focus is not directly focused on changing a policy or influencing a decision maker, we do want to have an understanding that ultimately that is the goal. Why are we doing what we're doing? We're trying to improve our understanding of the climate, and ultimately we're trying to influence our ability to sustain and mitigate the effects of that, even if you aren't directly focused on it. So having some understanding of those downstream implications, we would argue is an important part of what you're doing. It's also important to think about, and I'm going to ask you in a second to just sort of reflect to yourself just for 1 minute about what we think climate justice and injustice mean and your understanding of that. But it's not just an individual neighborhood or individual harm, right? We're always thinking about structures and systems and our relationship to those systems. So I already talked about who we are and our mandate as a science and technology center. Again, it can be easy to come to a research center and think that your only focus is to do your research and put your head down. That is just not the nature of research at a science and technology center. You are being integrated into a community of people who care about the world and are trying to maximize our impact. And so this is a great opportunity for you to start to peel back the onion and figure out where you fit into that equation. So I want you to think about, and I'm going to prompt you in just a second to think about the various ways that you might have influence. What might your influence be as a researcher? And that influence might be different than your research itself, right? The skills you have as a researcher might be a beneficial contribution to something as opposed to the exact questions that you address through your research. What might you do as a member of LEAP, of this particular scientific community, and what you might do as a citizen, a person in the world who stands to benefit from our ability to withstand this crisis as much as anyone else. Okay, I'll skip this and I want to go straight to food for thought. So I'm going to give you a series of questions. I just want you to take, and I'll keep loose track of time, 1 minute for each question to just brain dump your thoughts about it. You're not necessarily going to stand up and give a TED talk about it. It doesn't need to be perfectly constructed. You're just getting out your initial thoughts before we move into some smaller group discussion. Okay. Everyone has what they want to write on or type on. Okay, so the first question, easy. What are your academic disciplines and professional homes? In what spaces, disciplines in the academic sphere do you work? For some, that's one, and for people like me, it's many, right? Okay, second question. When you think of climate injustice, what picture emerges for you? Who's in it and where is it happening? And again, as a participant in this workshop, I would either participate or not be in the room. Next question. What's the difference in your understanding between climate change being unfair and climate change being unjust? Next question. Where does your current work touch climate injustice? And if it doesn't and you don't see it, that's okay to say. Where does your personal life touch climate injustice? I want you to think about all the rooms you're in. And this is sort of related to a bigger question around your spheres of influence. Where do you interact with people? This may be a lab, a classroom, hiring, training spaces. It could be within the university or beyond. It could be community groups that you're a part of. So I want you to do a brain dump around rooms and spheres of influence in your life that you have. It could be your soccer club, right? Could be anything. I want to stop there and I want to go back to the beginning and start thinking about this in conversation with others in the room. So I want to break into groups of 2 or 3 and start thinking about how you've answered some of these questions. And I'm doing that because one, I want you to try and articulate in some way what you're thinking, but also start hearing what other people were able to come up with to maybe sort of broaden the scope of what you're considering. Okay, so let's break into groups of 2 or 3. I look at the dread on your faces, but it'll be okay, I promise. And we'll start going through the questions together, and I'll give you some time to think about each one. So the first question, introducing yourself. What are your disciplines? Where are you coming from? Okay, so move to the next question. If you haven't finished, just briefly introduce your disciplines. What do you think of climate? What do you picture when you think about climate injustice? Who's in it? Where is it happening? I'll give you a few minutes to discuss that together, and then we'll come out and share as a group before we move to the next question. Okay, thanks. Okay. Sorry to interrupt. I know we could talk just about this, right? So just want to get a sense of what's coming up. What are you thinking of when we're talking about climate injustice, right? I could have given a whole lecture with slides breaking it down, but what's already in your brains about what this is, what it means, etc. It's always someone like, you were talking, and then yeah. What is your name? Gabriella. Gabriella, okay. Oh, Catherine's coming.
It's funny because you're from the Bay Area, right? California. I grew up in New York City, and the first thing we both thought of was redlining.
Redlining, yeah.
And I think it's also funny to throw this in there. I also, for some reason, think of like the summer because I feel like, I don't know, I just feel like it's more prominent in the summer when I see like this gap between like resources that communities that have resources and communities that don't, because
Right.
like for climate. Great question. I know the vague concept. I don't know if I'm the right person to explain it.
I can do it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So when we talk about redlining, it's a form of what we call structural racism. So when we think about structural racism, we're thinking about patterns that disadvantage groups of people. Those patterns were not random, right? People don't randomly end up in particular neighborhoods. We don't randomly decide where to dump waste. We make decisions about where to dump waste. We make decisions about who is worth poisoning versus who is not worth poisoning, right? Those aren't arbitrary decisions. Redlining was a practice that drew lines around different communities and made decisions about how valuable or invaluable were those communities. Which communities are worth investing in? Where should we put banks? Where should we put parks? Where should we put schools? Where should we put the post office? Where should we put grocery stores? Versus what neighborhoods are impoverished and not worth that investment? As you might imagine, that was also not random. It also was not objective. It broke down around racial lines, right? So it tended to treat Black and Brown communities as impoverished, not worth investment, and white communities as being worth investment. Not debatable. That was just the practice around the country, right? So every community got a line drawn around it. That's where the redlining comes from. And then decisions were made regarding investment. If you lived in a red neighborhood, it was considered dangerous, considered not worth investing in. It was difficult to get a loan. It was difficult to get resources to try and build and develop the neighborhood. And that continued for decades. So when you look at a neighborhood and let's say there's not a lot going on in the community, it's not always a choice of the community about what was in that neighborhood or not. Sometimes when we're naive about those spaces, we can enter them and think, why don't they open stores? Why don't they fix their yards? Why don't they take care of their parks? Why don't they pick up their trash? Those are municipal decisions. That's not necessarily people in the neighborhood making those types of decisions. And it has a long history that made it difficult to make those kinds of improvements. We see similar patterns today, even in terms of home valuation. So the Brookings Institute has a really interesting report where they look at homes that are very similar across neighborhoods and then look at how those homes are valued. And you might think that has huge implications for the accumulation of wealth, tax base in a neighborhood, et cetera. Any neighborhood, once it tips over 50% Black, the home valuations drop 10 to 30% around the country. Nothing else is different. The resources in the community are the same. The general qualities of the home are the same. The racial composition changes, right? So there's lots of people like me and others who figure out ways how to study and document those injustices, those inequities. It is not random. It's not because people care or not, or they work hard or not. There are structures that were deliberately put in place that has systematically disadvantaged groups of people. Okay, we'll stop there. There's other ways that we might think about how does that then translate into climate? Where's green space? Where's concrete? Who can afford air conditioning? Et cetera, right? So redlining, how neighborhoods are structured becomes a significant piece of this puzzle. What else came up for people? Yeah.
I initially thought of people today. I was initially thinking of like the current world, but I also like then and discussing, I think, like in, in the future generations, the people who are children today, the people who will like inherit the world a worse climate in the future, like at a global scale with, more political issues and many more like potential natural hazards.
So in your picture, how are you thinking about who's going to be most gravely impacted by the decisions we make right now? Yeah. Okay. Others? And it's okay not to know. So it's okay to have question marks, and then we can fill in gaps like, oh, what is redlining? How do we talk about that? How do we describe that? Right. Okay. What's your name?
My name is Alex.
Alex.
I guess the way I thought about this question was from like a disaster recovery perspective. I go to school in Los Angeles, and so last year the fires happened, and I guess it's also sort of like immediate attention. You saw how much more attention the Palisades, a white wealthy area, got than Altadena during the fires. So that's what I thought about.
Yeah. So what is even the narrative and story we're telling? Whose pain or harms are we emphasizing, and what might the downstream impacts of that be? So, for instance, I just want to highlight a couple of different pieces. How might the social sciences? Why might a psychologist, social worker be in a climate space, for instance, right? So I know, for instance, as someone who studies media, how important narratives are, and how narratives and how we talk about things in the media shape policy decisions, right? So it's not arbitrary. Our politicians don't always go into a deep dive of the empirical literature to make decisions about where to dedicate resources. They're often I'm going to be a little flippant, like, fairy dust and gut instinct and who they happen to care about, right? It's not always a substantive engagement of questions of data. Where are people most vulnerable? And that's where we're going to dedicate our resources. There's a lot of work that goes into shaping and crafting narratives through cultural systems that end up shaping policy decision-making and legislation, and ultimately the allocation of resources. So it's a very important point, Alex. Okay. What else came up? What were you picturing? What was emerging when you were thinking about it? Yeah, all right.
On a local level, I was thinking about data centers and where they're emerging in my neighborhood and who pays the price for that. And then on the global level, I was thinking about that and how that's influencing land grabs in places like the Amazon, and how the extraction of resources have always been a vehicle for how resources are monopolized or expanded upon, and who pays the price for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess along the themes about systemic problems, we also were thinking about like historically, globally, who has contributed most to the problem and who is now currently suffering the price, and it's very disproportionate. But then also, yeah, there's a lot of geopolitical issues involved in trying to get countries like the US, who are historically number one emitter, to, provide resources to those other countries that are being most impacted.
Yeah, so a lot of work around who was most responsible for contributing to the situation we find ourselves in versus who is bearing the brunt of those effects. And it's not equally distributed, and often the countries, parts of the world, and the groups of people who have had the least impact on where we are with the climate are the least able to weather that crisis. And have the fewest resources to actually advocate, right, for what it is that they're doing. But I don't want to paint a victim picture here, right, that a lot of climate advocacy work has happened in those communities first because they were the ones who were most impacted by it. They are most likely to experience flooding. They are most likely to experience extreme heat. Even here in Manhattan, right, different neighborhoods vary by order of multiple degrees in terms of how hot their communities get, depending on how much concrete is in the neighborhood, right? So where we put trees, et cetera, really matter. So I want to move on, but I want to emphasize, and it comes up a lot for people who might consider themselves basic researchers, right? That they have questions around research that they are exploring, that they aren't interested in or really focused on translating into the real world, and see that as actually a hindrance to the work that they're trying to do. There is no neutral position when it comes to this, right? This is not someone else's problem to deal with. It may not be central to your research. but you are a human in the world, and you should have some sense of how who you are and what you do has a relationship to the world that you're in, right? Even if it doesn't translate into exact research questions. I can sometimes see, and it's why I was emphasizing that if you're in the room, please be in the room, because I don't want you to seem despondent or checked out or like this doesn't have anything to do with you, or that's not why you came to Columbia. I'm trying to make it clear that, especially in this center, it is part of why you're here, is to understand your relationship to this. So I appreciate your presence and staying in it with me. Let's move to the next questions. I want to move to thinking about your spheres of influence. So what rooms are you in? Where do you find yourself? That might be your disciplinary home or homes. That might be other academic spaces and communities that you're a part of in person or digitally. It might be personal spaces. So you're trying to think about, if I were trying to influence people to understand something, where might I be able to do that? Where are the spaces that I could do that? So I want you to have that conversation, because you may get insights from other people in terms of what they name. So let's take a few minutes to talk about that. Okay, let's come back together. Before, okay, great, thank you. So what spaces, what spheres are coming up that are landing for you? How about from this area of the room? What were you talking about?
Friends came up a lot for us.
Friends. So your social networks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We got it. Yeah. Thank you. Other spaces?
I'd say that like Columbia as a whole has been really influential in like how I think and how I like view the world around me. Especially because Columbia has like the core curriculum and forces us to be in like 20 people seminar classes. And before college, I low-key thought I would just be like attending like 100 people lectures and not really like interacting with my community as tight as that.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad like I've had these like small conversations with people like from all around the country that I think like I would never have met. And I think that's definitely influenced like my way of thinking and like my perspective on just like life in general.
Yeah. And increasingly, even engineering schools, including the engineering school here, are moving more and more to thinking about how do we prepare our engineers and scientists to understand their relationship to these issues. In fact, what we're learning is it's quite dangerous when you don't. The problems you can cause and contribute to, the things that you might not be able that you're positioned to help with, but don't, because you don't understand your relationship to these systems. You are not neutral. You are not separate from it. So the core curriculum is one way that pulls you into that conversation, regardless of your discipline or major. Yeah. There was a hand here.
I was just thinking about like how I had some influence also all of the rooms I can be part of. And I was once a CSR project manager in a company, in an agency event. And like the only fact that I was in the room somewhere like brought up the subject about climate change, even though I wasn't the one who brought the subject up. Right. Like it was crazy. I was just there and was like, and they were like, oh, but you know, I am vegetarian. I'm taking care of all the stuff. I'm sorting my yeah, everything. And I was like, okay, I'm not the one bringing this up, but it's okay. Like
Yeah. And sometimes, especially when you're more junior, it's easy to think, oh, I don't have any power. Who am I to say that we should be doing this differently, et cetera. And I would argue that to a certain extent that is true. And you always have power and you always have agency. And if you don't find it, and if you don't know enough to even notice when something's going off the rails or a decision is being made that could be harmful, if you don't know enough to even start to think about, wait a second, is this the right way we should be going? Or should we be asking different kinds of questions? The train will just leave the station and you will be on it having participated, right, in harms. When I think about my work in terms of racism, I argue that it's either anti-racist or it's racist. There's no in between. Either you're actively thinking about how not to perpetuate harms that systems like redlining, et cetera, have historically been set up to do. Either you actively disrupt that harm or you are a participant in perpetuating it. There is no in between, right? And it's important for us to think about, and it's not just racism, it's all sorts of metrics. It's important to think about, how am I disrupting it? How might I potentially disrupt it? And at least ask yourself the question, or you'll just passively contribute to inequity, even if it's how your work gets used years down the line, because we weren't having conversations with various stakeholders from the very beginning to think about how we might anticipate utilization, or how we might think about data, what data's missing, how are we interpreting data that might be different in a different part of the world, right? So it matters on a number of different metrics. And if you don't have a practice that anticipates and thinks about that, then you become a passive contributor and a dangerous contributor to some of these very inequities, right, that we're talking about. Okay. I want to take a moment, and this will be your individual reflection. I want you to think about a single room, a single space, a way in which your work might intersect with this in ways that maybe you weren't previously anticipating or thinking about. I want you to do a little bit of a brain dump. It doesn't have to be a room, but I want you to do a little bit of a brain dump around, where might I start to think about this more? What else do I need to know and understand? There's only so much that can be conveyed in an hour, right? But if there's some sense that you're walking away with, that there are structural patterns in inequity in society across metrics, and that all aspects of society intersect with climate in some way, then climate injustice intersects with all those components as well. It impacts the same injustices that we talk about around policing or environmental pollutants or educational systems or financial systems, et cetera, apply to climate as well. They're all related, they all intersect. So start to think about, where your spheres of influence, where do you need to take a next step to start thinking about how this relates to you and your work. And I'll just give you a couple of minutes to reflect on that on your own. You don't have to discuss it with each other, but I want you to start thinking about for yourself. If you're in a place where you still think this doesn't apply to you, I would suggest you come and talk to me, and I will give you a syllabus of things you should read and think about to try and figure out what this might mean for you. And I'm happy to do that regardless, right? Most of us don't have an educational background that helps us really have a knowledge base for understanding this. Okay, but start with what's coming up for you right now, how this might relate to your work, how it might intersect with what you're doing. Or what do you want to keep doing if you're already engaged in the space? So take a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, and you can keep thinking about it. Hopefully it's something that you'll continue to think about, and you should definitely think about me and the knowledge transfer team and the education team as a resource if you're curious about having a deeper conversation about finding where this intersects with your life in a meaningful way, especially in the professional space. I just want to share the comment from Daniel, who's one of our colleagues at NCAR. And he says, I'm presently thinking about the convergent science initiatives at NCAR and how we aim to build a culture around impactful use-based science and collaboration and co-development with communities who are either affected by or could benefit from scientific understanding and applications. This goes beyond collaborating across academic departments and disciplines, but also collaborating with communities. Many communities get left out of science discussions, and intentional efforts need to be made to invite them to the table and even allow them to co-lead and contribute to their own ideas and needs. And so we'll share this with you so that you can see an example of a hugely impactful organization like NCAR thinking about expanding impact in this way as well. Before we close, I just want to ask what questions are coming up for you? What kinds of spaces? Where are the tensions, or maybe you have question marks where you're struggling to make the connection to your professional life? I'm just curious what's in the room, which can help us shape future conversations and support around this. Were you able to find a point of influence, or you're tinkering with the possibility of an influence, or you're struggling to make a connection and you're not quite sure where to go, especially on the professional side? It may be more obvious for you as a citizen, as a person in the world, and it may be more difficult on the professional side. And if that is a difficulty, that would be helpful for us to know and understandable.
I can volunteer, let's say, two places that I haven't quite put together. One is like, being a parent, and so also like a members of my school, my daughter's school community. And the other is like, being a member of LEAP, and I participate in the Summer Institute. And so I thought, perhaps some of the activity that we develop for teachers there is something that I could, maybe in the future try and bring to her school, or, like other local schools. Yeah, I hadn't, this hadn't clicked for me before, but I think it was helpful to think of spaces and then try to think how they can be connected.
And think about like your understanding of data and science and climate and how that might sort of intersect with the school.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Because we with the Summer Institute, we try to think about, okay, how can we communicate climate, for example, to teachers, right? Public school teachers, and we have developed activities. And but I figure, okay, I never thought about, I could, take this and then go to my daughter's school, which is a Title I school, and see if we can collaborate together to get something, more.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful experience here as well at LEAP to have so many of our scientists sort of deeply engage with us, even if they weren't quite sure what their contribution could be, but they were willing to enter the conversation with us and try and find it, to engage with different community partners and relationships. So many of our scientists participated in the hackathon at the American Museum of Natural History that helped people develop, again, real world interventions using various kinds of data. And again, it is part of the culture of a science and technology center that you're entering into. And if you only want to do research, this might not be the best place for you. I mean, you'll still get a great training experience, but you won't be fully integrating yourself into the ethos and culture of the center. Other touch points, sticky points, questions that are coming up, again, that might help us support you over the course of your time here.
Yeah, no, I think you mentioned the hackathon, and I think something that was really both stabilizing and innovative about that was how interdisciplinary it was, and people coming together in a very directed way. And I'm thinking about the comment about the core curriculum, and so I think I'd be curious to know how much of the reflections that folks did on their own, like what are the convergences, right? Like where are there opportunities to think about if there are similar rooms people are in, if there are similar understandings of what justice looks like and what it doesn't look like. So yeah, I think it's just an advocating for more room for these sorts of conversations because clearly there's a lot here.
Yeah. Is there another there? So it's understandable. Like I didn't get a chance to sort of ask you what your disciplinary backgrounds are. I can guess, right? Have a sense of like sort of generally who's in the room, and it's understandable if you have not yet had a background that's more social science, humanities focused about how did we get to the climate crisis. Why are people unevenly impacted by that crisis, right? They may seem obvious, or you may have a cursory understanding of that, but there are people who spend a lot of time trying to unpack and understand and document those effects. I think as climate scientists, it is your responsibility to have some understanding of it. And we're happy to help support your development and growth in that regard. Again, the translation may not always be, I'm adding a new research question, or I'm approaching data differently because of my understanding of this, but it might be, and you might surprise yourself about how your work could be impacted by that understanding. But certainly as a scientist in the world whose work will ultimately impact, hopefully, what we do, the decisions we make, and how we survive the climate crisis, you need to understand how we got there. And you need to understand your relationship to it. And it's often done in collaboration with other people with other skill sets who study media and narrative and storytelling, who can help figure out how to best translate and get your work into the hands of people who use it. It's working with a knowledge transfer team who have an understanding of how the city of New York is trying to make decisions, and something you say to us might trigger something that we think is useful for them to use. So it's often done in community and collaboration, and that's the nature of an STC, is to create opportunities for that overlap. We're not expecting you to become an expert in climate justice per se. We're expecting you to do some work to think about your relationship to it and to find the opportunities for meaningful change, either through programs that we're hosting here or in other aspects of your life. I really hope you see the team, Catherine, Molly, RA, the education team and knowledge transfer team. We're the humanities, social sciencey folks, right, in the space. And we're more than happy to help you think about this or offer resources, things that you might be reading, etc. And I encourage this, when you go into work or you dive deep into your dissertations or your tenure track jobs, et cetera, it only gets more and more difficult to do this. And so for the earlier in the career path folks among you in the space, take the time in a summer program to really think about this and figure out where you stand. And if I can convey anything before I close, is that you're not neutral. You're causing harm or you're trying to mitigate harm, but there really is no in between, right? Either help, or things will keep going without you. Okay, thank you all for your time today, and I'll stay if you have any questions. And I think we have pizza outside for those of you who need sustenance. Okay, thanks.